we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. My cousin Nate has been serving in the Coast Guard for over 10 years. He's not the kind of guy who makes things up. He is about as straightforward as they come. Practical, grounded, not superstitious at all. He doesn't even like horror movies, so when he told me this story during the summer of 2022, I knew he wasn't exaggerating. I even made him repeat it a few times, and every single retelling was word for word the same. What happened to him dates back to 2017, during a lighthouse assignment off the coast of Maine. The place was called Matinous Rock, a jagged outcrop of stone in the middle of the ocean. It's so isolated that you can only reach it by helicopter or boat. On the island sits just a single lighthouse and a small auxiliary building for fuel and equipment. There's no plumbing, no power grid, and barely any phone reception. The lighthouse runs on automation, but the Coast Guard still sends people every so often to do upkeep. Normally it's a solo post, but the previous year there had been odd power malfunctions, so this time they sent 2 men, Nate and another serviceman named Russell. The first few days were uneventful, windy, lonely, routine. During daylight hours they inspected the mechanics of the beacon, checked backup batteries, topped off the generator, and scraped layers of rusted salt from the walls. At night they'd eat simple rations, read, and pass time playing cards. Boring, but nothing alarming. That changed on the 4th night. Nate woke suddenly at 2 a.m. with a strange heaviness in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Except the sky outside was clear. Something felt wrong. He sat up and immediately noticed the sweeping light from the beacon was gone. That was serious. The light was supposed to rotate non-stop. He roused Russell, and the 2 of them climbed the narrow spiral staircase up the tower. When they reached the beacon, they found the rotation gears were still turning, but the light was stuck. Jamming the mechanism was a huge piece of soaked fabric, black and slimy, reeking of mildew and seaweed. It looked like a blanket or coat wedged deep into the gears. They couldn't figure out how it had gotten there. Everything had been locked tight. They pulled it free, threw it out into the night air, and tried to shrug it off. But the next night, just after 2 a.m., the exact same thing happened. This time the blockage wasn't a blanket, but a smaller piece of fabric. A faded red scarf, frayed and waterlogged, dotted with barnacles like it had been dredged straight out of the ocean. That's when Nate's unease turned to fear. They double-checked doors, windows, closets. Everything was secure. Yet somehow, something had gotten in. From then on, they barricaded the stairwell with heavy crates and locked the beacon room after every inspection. Still, on the 7th night, things escalated. Nate awoke to hear Russell whispering in the dark. At first he thought Russell was speaking to him, but it was clear he was murmuring toward the corner of the room. When Nate asked what he was saying, Russell blinked, confused, and claimed he hadn't said a word. Later that same night, Nate woke again to find Russell at the window, staring down at the rocks below. Russell muttered that he had seen someone standing there the previous night, just barely visible at the edge of the light before vanishing again. As the days went on, Russell unraveled. He hardly slept, barely spoke, and spent hours gazing out the window. He muttered about scratching in the walls, about whispers rising from the stairwell. On the 9th night, both men heard footsteps above them. Not the creaks of the tower shifting in the wind, but steady, deliberate footsteps, descending from the beacon room. Nate looked over and saw Russell frozen at the bottom of the stairs. Both swore they hadn't moved. They listened, holding their breath, until the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. That night, they shoved a dresser in front of the door and slept with knives under their pillows. By the 11th night, the beacon failed again, but this time, when they reached the top of the tower, the door was wide open, swinging in the wind as if forced. Inside, the light wasn't simply jammed, it had been tampered with. The massive bulb had been removed and set upright in the middle of the floor. That industrial bulb required serious effort to unscrew. No way it could have happened by accident. Nate stood frozen, horrified. Russell just whispered that someone had done it. Then Nate felt something cold brush across his back. He spun around, but the room was empty. Russell went pale, staring at the wall, insisting he had just seen a hand emerge from the bricks. They bolted back to the lower level and locked themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell spent the night rocking in the corner, whispering to someone invisible. At dawn, Nate used the emergency sat phone and demanded immediate extraction, reporting a critical failure. The boat arrived later that day, but the strangest detail was still to come. The crew asked about the distress call they had received hours earlier, at 2:12 a.m. Nate swore he hadn't touched the phone until daylight, yet the Coast Guard had received a broken, static-filled message with a voice warning that someone else was there with them before the call cut out. Russell said nothing on the entire ride back. He resigned from the Coast Guard within months, never sharing what he saw. Nate still works maintenance runs, but he flat out refuses, to ever step foot on Matinus Rock again. This happened during the height of the COVID lockdowns, at that point where everyone was restless and losing their minds from being stuck indoors. I was single back then, spending my nights swiping on Tinder or DMing people while half watching whatever was on Netflix. There wasn't much else to do. That when I started talking to this girl I'd followed on Instagram for years named Sophia. She goes by Soph online. We both live in Suffolk County, Long Island, about 20 or 30 minutes from the Hamptons and roughly an hour from Montauk. One night we were bored enough to actually meet up. She lived just a few minutes away, so I picked her up. We drove to a nearby park that was technically closed, drinking White Claws in my car. Right away I got her vibe, rebellious but in a cool, adventurous way. She was totally fine with trespassing and hopping fences. Within an hour she suggested something bold, driving all the way out to Montauk to walk the cliff trail around the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds were closed after dark, maybe even completely off limits because of lockdown, but I was down. I like little adventures. We finished our drinks, got back on the road, and headed east toward Montauk Point. When we got there, she told me to park right in the lighthouse lot. I hesitated but saw no cars anywhere and took her word for it. She'd done it before, she said, even pre-COVID. We cracked open another White Claw while parked, and every so often I nervously scanned for security vehicles while she kept telling me to relax. We eventually started walking up toward the lighthouse. Seeing it at night up close was surreal, majestic but eerie. There's something liminal about lighthouses in the dark that's hard to describe. Soph led the way off the main entrance path to avoid the lights and keep us less visible. This was my first time ever at Montauk Lighthouse, and she took us straight behind it, down to the rocky cliffside trail called the Cliff Walk. We navigated only by our phone flashlights. Maybe there were supposed to be lights down there normally, but that night most of them were off except for a few near the main entrance and the sweeping beacon above. As we made our way along the rocks, Soph, who had fallen behind me, suddenly said my name. I turned and saw her aiming her flashlight behind us, revealing a figure standing on the rocks. When we both shone our lights, it became clearer. A man in a hooded coat just standing there. He looked like he might have been black, but we couldn't tell his age or much else. I called out, asking if he worked there. No answer. He didn't move either. I tried again, apologizing and saying we'd leave, thinking maybe he was security. Then he spoke. "Y'all want to buy some Coke?" Finding out he wasn't security was no relief at all. If anything, it was worse. Why was this random guy following us out here at night? I said, "No man, we're good," and motioned for Soph to keep moving. I let her walk in front and we continued forward. But the man started walking too. He didn't say anything else, no "you sure" or anything, just kept pace with us silently. Every time I glanced back with my light, he was still there, the same distance behind us. The whole thing was bizarre and unnerving. We finally reached the end of the cliff walk and cut back through the grass toward the parking lot. The man was still behind us, keeping speed. Then we heard him call out something. It sounded like, "Where are you going?" His tone wasn't friendly. I didn't respond and told Soph to stay quiet. We quickened our pace toward the car. That's when I noticed two more men approaching from another direction behind us. I didn't want to break into a run and trigger a chase, but one of them shouted something I couldn't make out. We reached the car, climbed in fast, and both screamed when we realized all three men were suddenly right next to the car. I locked the doors immediately, seconds before two of them tried the handles. I threw the car in reverse, the only way to pull out without hitting them. They kicked and slapped the car as we backed out, but they didn't chase us once we were moving. On the drive back, our hearts were pounding. After the adrenaline wore off, we sat in silence. I dropped her off and we called it a night. We ended up hanging out plenty of times after that and we're still in touch. But honestly, that night still freaks me out. It felt way too close to something really bad happening. My friends think it might have been a gang, maybe the Crips. Whatever it was, I have zero interest in ever going back there at night again. My name is Gregory. This was a story my old friend Ian has told me many times that happened to him many moons ago. I asked him to give me a detailed version in writing recently that he gave me permission to share online because I always found it so unsettling. Ian was one of those guys you only had to meet once to know he was the real deal. 50-some, solid build, weathered skin from decades working in salt air. He worked in marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. Basically, when something broke near the water, Ian was one of the people you'd call to go fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship technician, even spent time doing remote inspections for the government. The guy had seen just about everything. So when he told me this story, I didn't doubt it. Not for a second. He said it happened back in 2013 when he got hired by a small county up in Washington state to do a structural inspection of an old decommissioned lighthouse. The county had inherited the property years earlier and didn't know what to do with it. Developers wanted to tear it down. Historians wanted to preserve it, and no one wanted to pay for it either. So Ian's job was simple: go there alone, assess the place inside and out, and figure out whether it was even safe to restore. The lighthouse was on a remote rock island about an hour off the mainland. Not a big island either, just a hunk of stone and dirt, maybe 300 ft wide, with nothing but the lighthouse itself, a generator shed, and some rusted-out old scaffolding from decades past. The place hadn't been used in years, and it wasn't exactly a tourist destination. There weren't even any docks, just a little ledge where a small Coast Guard boat could offload someone at high tide. Ian packed light, food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, some tools, a clipboard, and a two-way marine radio. The plan was simple. He'd get dropped off Monday morning, do a full walkthrough by Wednesday, and call in for pickup Thursday afternoon. He didn't think twice about going alone. He'd done this sort of thing dozens of times before. When he first got there, the place was quiet, cold, cloudy, but calm. The air had that usual mix of salt, metal, and decay you expect from something that's been sitting abandoned for decades. The lighthouse itself was tall, maybe 50 feet. Built in the early 1900s, it had the classic spiral staircase inside, which led up to the beacon room. That glass lens hadn't worked in decades, but the structure itself was solid. Ian did his usual safety checks: support beams, stair integrity, window fittings. The floorboards on the lower level were warped but walkable. The second floor was a storage room which was empty except for some rusted metal cabinets. The third floor had a tiny sleeping quarter that hadn't been used in decades. He ended up laying out his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room where it was warmer and out of the wind. The first night was uneventful. It was quiet. Like too quiet, Ian said. You don't notice how noisy the world usually is until it's not. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of waves slapping against the rocks outside, just wind, and even that was soft. On the second day, the fog rolled in thick. Ian woke up to a completely white world outside. You couldn't see more than 5 ft beyond the window. He said it wasn't like any fog he'd seen before. It was so dense it looked solid, like a wall, but he didn't think much of it. That area got heavy fog often. He spent most of the day taking notes on the upper stairwell. That's when he noticed the first weird thing. Halfway up the staircase to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He tried to open it on day one, but the hinges were so corroded it wouldn't budge. But now it was open a crack. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough that you could tell it had been moved. He figured the moisture in the air had caused it to shift, but he didn't like it. The inside of the closet was pitch black, and when he pushed the door wider, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A wooden box maybe the size of a lunchbox, and it was covered in a kind of damp moss like it had been underwater recently. He didn't open it. He just shut the door again and made a note to report it. That night something woke him up. He said it wasn't a sound exactly, but more so the absence of sound, like everything had stopped. And then he heard footsteps on the metal stairs above him. At first, he thought an animal got inside, but then he realized they weren't descending. The steps were going upward. Whatever was in the tower was climbing. He turned on his flashlight and stared at the stairwell entrance, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, the sound stopped and the silence returned. The next day, he searched the whole place top to bottom. He checked every room and every closet. He even climbed onto the roof, but there was nothing. No animals or anything out of the ordinary except that box. It was now sitting outside the closet, halfway into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He said he stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The wood was bloated with moisture, but the lid didn't open. It was nailed shut. He didn't want to mess with it too much, so he left it at the base of the stairs and went outside for air. That's when he noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. Bare footprints, not boots or shoes, but bare wet feet leading from the north side of the building toward the cliff edge, and then stopping. The footprints didn't circle back. They were just 10 or 12 barefoot impressions in the mud that ended at a sheer drop into the sea. He said he stood there for a long time trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come ashore, but the only boat scheduled was his return ride, and that wasn't for another day. He considered using the radio to call for an early pickup, but the fog was so thick that by then they probably wouldn't even be able to navigate back. He went inside and locked every door and hatch, and then he wedged the stairwell shut with an iron pipe and he tried to sleep. That night was worse. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door to the upper beacon room slam shut violently. He said the force shook dust loose from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside wall of the tower. Not the front door or window, but the wall itself. Like someone standing just inches behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles against the brick. Ian didn't move. He lay there frozen until the sound stopped. When the sun came up, he checked everything again. The box was gone and the closet door was fully open. At this point, it was abundantly clear he wasn't alone there. So Ian used the radio and called for immediate extraction. The fog was still heavy, but he told them it was a medical issue. They said they'd try to get a boat there within a few hours. He packed everything and waited by the landing ledge. The fog didn't clear. In fact, it apparently got thicker. He sat there for nearly 7 hours, unable to see anything more than a few feet in front of him. The sun was going down and the air had gotten cold. He heard someone walking behind him in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse. But when he turned around, there was no one there, or he simply just couldn't see who it was through the fog. He ran to the edge of the cliff and stayed there until he heard the boat horn in the distance. They pulled him out just after dark. The deckhand who helped him on board asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian told him that the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. He filed a brief report back at the office. He said the structure was compromised and not fit for entry, but he never mentioned the footsteps or the box. He told me he didn't because he genuinely considered the possibility that he simply was losing his mind in isolation. This was around the end of what Ian sent me in writing. Ian never went back to that lighthouse. He wrapped up his remaining projects that year and quietly phased himself out of field work. Within a year, he stopped taking contracts altogether. Said he wanted to focus on dry land from then on. When I asked if it was because of the lighthouse, he just shrugged and said he'd seen enough out there. I pressed him just once about what he really thought happened on that island. He looked me dead in the eye and said something that kind of stuck with me ever since. He said, "Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence." That was all he'd say. I tried to look into the lighthouse myself a while back, but I couldn't find much. The coordinates he'd scribbled in his notes don't point to any listed structure. The county records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there's no official name, and no accessible history. It's like he was never really there in the first place. And that's the part that unsettles me most. Not what Ian said, but what nobody else ever did. I don't honestly know whether I hope Ian really was just for whatever reason going crazy on that island or not.